A city that never slept with silence in seconds. One moment, bright towers and busy streets were alive. The next, everything was swallowed by darkness. This was no ordinary power failure. This was the night the city learned the cost of ignoring one woman's warnings. The evening began like any other in the bustling city. Neon signs flashed advertisements across tall glass towers. Restaurants overflowed with laughter and conversation, and traffic lights guided endless streams of cars along crowded avenues. It was a world of sound, light, and constant movement. Nobody suspected that within minutes, the familiar hum of electricity, the very lifeline of their modern lives, would be gone. At 7:42 p.m., just as the sun's last glow sank beneath the horizon, the first ripple hit. A sudden flicker swept through office buildings downtown. Computer screens blinked. Elevators jolted for a split second. Street lamps hesitated, buzzing faintly before stabilizing again. To the average eye, it was a minor glitch, the kind of thing that happens in an overworked grid. But to those who understood electricity, to those who had been watching closely, it was a warning sign. Within 60 seconds, that warning turned into catastrophe. The entire grid collapsed in a cascade. Lights and skyscrapers blinked out floor by floor like dominoes falling in silence. Traffic signals across intersections went dark, leaving drivers honking in panic as cars screeched and swerved blindly. Air conditioners, televisions, computers, everything shut down in one collective gasp, as though the city itself had lost its breath. Then came the sound. Alarms from buildings wailed into the night, shrill echoes bouncing to the concrete canyons of downtown. Emergency generators sputtered awake in hospitals and fire stations, their dull hum struggling to compensate. In apartments and high-rises, people stumbled through dark hallways, using their phone flashlights, voices trembling with confusion. The skyline, once glowing like a crown of jewels, was now a shadow against the starlit sky. Nobody could believe it. This city prided itself on being untouchable. The kind of place where electricity outages were something that happened out there in smaller towns. Never here. Yet now, millions of people found themselves plunged into the 19th century in a matter of seconds. In a busy restaurant, candles were rushed to tables, servers whispering apologies as families tried to laugh off the shock. In a hospital, doctors barked orders, rushing to stabilize patients whose lives depended on machines now running on fragile backup systems. In the subway tunnels beneath the streets, trains screeched to a halt, leaving hundreds of commuters trapped in suffocating darkness, their only light the dim red glow of emergency exit signs. Panic spread faster than the blackout itself. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter. Strangers shared flashlights with one another, forming shaky alliances in the face of uncertainty. News anchors, mid-broadcast, disappeared from television screens, their voices cut off mid-sentence. Cell towers overloaded as everyone tried to call loved ones at the same time. Within minutes, service lines jammed, leaving people more isolated than ever. And amid all the confusion, the questions began. What caused this? How could the city go dark all at once? For some, it was simply frightening. For others, it was infuriating. But for a select few, those who remembered a woman's repeated warnings at council meetings, this wasn't surprise at all. Somewhere in the darkness, a name began to echo, a woman they had dismissed, ignored, and even mocked, a woman who had stood before microphones and begged them to take her seriously, Dr. Maya Johnson. She had warned them that the system was fragile, that their negligence and arrogance would push the city into disaster. But they had laughed, rolled their eyes, and moved on with their meetings. To them, she was just one more alarmist, one more troublemaker trying to stir unnecessary panic. But tonight, as millions stumbled through streets without light, as the skyline lay powerless, and as the hum of electricity vanished, Maya's words returned with vengeance. In a neighborhood on the city's edge, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve as they lit candles in their living room. "Mom," he whispered, "is this what she was talking about? The lady on TV?" His mother didn't answer. She only stared into the flame, remembering how she, too, had once laughed at Maya's desperate pleas. The blackout wasn't just an accident. It was a result of years of warnings silenced, years of arrogance from those in power. And though the city didn't know it yet, the darkness they stumbled to was not merely a technical failure. It was a decision, deliberate and undeniable. Back downtown, the mayor sat in a candlelit office, surrounded by advisors fumbling with emergency radios. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. He knew exactly whose name would be on every citizen's lips come morning. He had silenced her in meetings, called her dramatic, told reporters she was misinformed. Now he could feel the weight of her truth pressing down on him in every flickering shadow. The blackout wasn't random. It was personal. But while officials scrambled and citizens panicked, one person stood calm in the chaos. Maya Johnson herself. Far from shocked, she watched the city crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. She knew this moment would come, and though she hadn't wanted innocent lives to suffer, she understood the necessity of truth being revealed in the harshest way possible. For years, she had begged them to act. Now, in the silence of a city that once buzzed with arrogance, her warning was undeniable. The night stretched on, filled with the chaos of sirens, shouts, and the flicker of candles in apartment windows. Fear and confusion tangled together as people searched for answers. But one truth began to take shape in whispered conversations and hurried thoughts. Someone had tried to prevent this. Someone had known. And by the time the sun rose again, the entire city would know her name. This was not just a blackout. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The night of the blackout was the moment everyone learned her name, but Maya Johnson's story hadn't started there. Long before the city plunged into silence, before her warnings echoed in every darkened street, she was just a woman with a notebook, a sharp mind, and a persistence that most people mistook for stubbornness. Maya grew up in the very neighborhoods now suffering under the blackout. Her earliest memories were sitting on the porch with her father, a retired electrician, watching the street lamps buzz to life each evening. He would explain to her how the grid worked, how wires carried invisible energy from distant plants into the homes of thousands. To most children, it would have sounded like a dull lecture. To Maya, it was magic. She would sit with wide eyes, asking endless questions until her father laughed and shook his head, saying, "Girl, one day you'll know more about this stuff than me." He wasn't wrong. By the time Maya was in high school, she was building small circuits from scrap wires and batteries. Teachers noticed her talent, though some underestimated her. She was often the only black girl in advanced science classes, a fact that drew whispers and skepticism. But each time someone doubted her, Maya pushed harder, as if fueled by the challenge. When she won her first regional science fair with a homemade solar-powered generator, her competitors sneered. She didn't care. She had proof her ideas worked. College was where her brilliance sharpened. She earned a scholarship to study electrical engineering at a prestigious university, walking into lecture halls where she once again stood out, not just for her gender and race, but for her refusal to be silent. Professors quickly realized she wasn't there to just memorize formulas. She wanted to understand systems from the ground up. She asked questions others avoided, pointing out flaws in designs that professionals considered untouchable. Some admired her courage. Others called her difficult. Maya didn't mind either label. After graduating with honors, she went further, pursuing a doctorate in energy systems. Her research focused on urban power grids, the veins and arteries of a city. She studied how they age, how corruption and budget cuts hollowed them out, and how neglect always led to disaster. Her dissertation wasn't just academic. It was a warning. She argued that cities, blinded by expansion and greed, were building fragile systems that could collapse under the smallest stress. Her findings should have been a wake-up call. Instead, they became another reason for powerful people to dismiss her. Too pessimistic, one reviewer wrote. Unrealistic scenarios, another claimed. But Maya knew better. She had seen it firsthand. Transformers sparking in poor neighborhoods, outages brushed aside as normal, and officials pocketing money meant for upgrades. So when she returned to her hometown after years of study, Maya didn't come back as just another academic. She came as a watchdog, determined to keep her city safe. She joined local community boards, gave talks at schools, and volunteered to consult for neighborhood associations. Wherever she went, she carried that same worn leather notebook, filled with calculations, sketches, and warnings. People in her community trusted her. But in City Hall, the place where it mattered most, she was an outsider. Her first encounter with the city council set the tone. Standing at a podium in a crowded chamber, Maya presented evidence of overworked substations and decaying transformers. Her voice was clear, steady but firm. "If nothing is done," she said, "this grid will collapse. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it does, it won't just be an inconvenience. It will be a disaster." The room buzzed with murmurs, but the officials at the table barely lifted their eyes from their phones and papers. One councilman leaned back, smirking, and muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Another doomsayer." Laughter rippled through the chamber. Maya stood her ground, but inside, the sting was sharp. She wasn't naive. She knew change never came easy, but the outright dismissal burned deeper than she expected. Still, she didn't stop. For years, she pushed forward, attending meetings, submitting reports, even writing to newspapers. Sometimes her words made the opinion pages, but more often they were buried beneath stories of new skyscrapers, shopping centers, and the city's bright future. Progress, they called it. Maya saw for what it was, weight piled on a fragile skeleton. What hurt most wasn't the laughter or the dismissals. It was the silence of people who knew she was right, but refused to speak up. Engineers she once studied with, colleagues who admitted privately that the system was flawed, yet said nothing in public. Fear of losing contracts, fear of angering the council, fear of being labeled like Maya, difficult. The irony was bitter. A woman who had spent her life mastering the grid was ignored by the very people who depended on her knowledge. To them, she was not an expert. She was an inconvenience. And yet, Maya kept watching. She noticed each flicker in the lights across her neighborhood. She tracked every unexplained surge in local substations. She scribbled notes when storms overloaded transformers that hadn't been replaced in decades. Each piece of data was a reminder that the collapse she predicted wasn't far away. It was inevitable. Her friends asked her why she bothered. "Maya, they don't listen. Why waste your breath?" But she couldn't stop. For her, this wasn't about ego. It was about the people, the families in apartments, the patients in hospitals, the children doing homework by lamplight. They deserved safety, and Maya refused to give up on them, even when the city gave up on her. By the time the blackout struck, most citizens only vaguely remembered her. Some had seen her on the local news months ago, passionately warning about the grid. Others recalled her standing outside City Hall with a small group of supporters, holding up charts while officials brushed past. But now, in the dark, her persistence loomed large. Maya herself didn't see the blackout as a victory. Sitting alone in her apartment that night, surrounded by candles and silence, she felt the weight of it all. She didn't want chaos. She didn't want hospitals scrambling or families terrified. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was for the city to listen before it came to this. But now that the darkness had arrived, she knew the story had shifted. For years, she had been the ignored woman in the back of the room. Now, she was the only one who had seen the truth coming. The blackout wasn't just a technical failure. It was the city's failure to listen. And Maya Johnson, the woman they had dismissed, had become the symbol of everything they could no longer deny. The blackout that shook the city would not have been such a shock if people had listened to Maya Johnson years earlier. Long before the night when skyscrapers fell dark and sirens filled the air, Maya had seen the cracks forming in the system. She knew where the danger lay, and she tried, again and again, to sound the alarm. It began with small details, things most people would never notice. A transformer on the east side overheating too frequently. Flickers in streetlights that weren't caused by storms. substations carrying loads higher than what they had been designed for decades ago. Maya's trained, I picked up on each of these signals, and every time she found one, she wrote it down in her leather notebook. She wasn't just collecting random observations. She was building a case. By the time she had her first serious presentation ready, her notes stretched back months. She prepared graphs showing how the load on certain substations had increased by nearly 30% over 5 years without any upgrades. She created charts comparing the city's infrastructure budget to the actual costs needed to maintain a safe grid. The gap was alarming. And when she ran simulations, models showing how a single failure could cascade through the system like falling dominoes, she felt a chill. It wasn't a question of if the grid would fail. It was only a question of when. She requested time at the city council meeting to present her findings. Her neighbors encouraged her, proud that someone was standing up for the community. They believed her expertise would be taken seriously. After all, she had the degrees, the research, and the evidence. Surely the officials would see the danger. When her turn finally came, Maya stood before the council, her heart steady but her determination fierce. She explained how the substations were overloaded, how neglect was pushing the system toward collapse. "I'm not here to create panic," she said firmly. "I'm here to prevent it. If we act now, if we replace outdated transformers and reroute excess loads, we can avoid disaster." The chamber was quiet for a moment, her words hanging in the air. Then one of the council members, a man with graying hair and a condescending smile, leaned back in his chair and asked, "And how much will all of this cost the taxpayers?" Maya opened her binder, ready to explain. But before she could finish, another official waved a dismissive hand. "We've had outages before," he said. "The system always recovers. You're making it sound like the city will collapse tomorrow." Laughter followed his words. Several in the audience chuckled too, not out of malice, but because that's what the tone from the council invited. Dismissal. Maya stood her ground, though her stomach tightened. This isn't about small outages. This is about a cascading failure. One substation goes, then another and another. It spreads. You could lose entire districts. But the council wasn't listening. Their questions weren't about safety. They were about money, public image, and whether listening to her would make them look weak. By the end of her presentation, her warnings had been politely received, but everyone in the room knew nothing would come of it. When she left City Hall that evening, her community members patted her on the back, telling her she had done well. But Maya's face was heavy with disappointment. Doing well in the room didn't matter if the people with power refused to act. Still, she refused to give up. Over the next year, she returned to the council 3 more times, each time with new data. She showed how a minor surge nearly shut down a hospital wing. She revealed reports from energy inspectors that had been quietly shelved. She even brought photographs, corroded wires, leaking oil from transformers, and technicians using outdated equipment that should have been replaced years ago. Each time, she hoped the growing evidence would force them to take her seriously. And each time, she met the same wall. "You're exaggerating. The system is stable. We don't have the budget for alarmist projects." At one meeting, a young councilwoman tried to support her, suggesting at least an independent audit of the grid, but her voice was drowned out by the louder, older men at the table. One even leaned into his microphone and said, "Dr. Johnson, maybe you're just too close to the problem. Sometimes engineers see issues that aren't really there." The words stung more than the laughter. Too close to the problem? She had studied these systems her entire life. She had spent nights poring over data that no one else bothered to analyze. And yet, her expertise was brushed aside as though it were nothing more than paranoia. The frustration built inside her like pressure in a sealed pipe. Outside those chambers, Maya was respected. Local communities saw her as a voice of reason. University students invited her to guest lectures. Neighborhood groups called her when their lights flickered. But in the halls where decisions were made, the halls that could actually fix the problems, she was invisible. She often went home after those meetings and sat in the dark of her small apartment, staring at the city skyline. The lights looked beautiful from a distance, a glittering sea of energy. But Maya didn't see beauty, she saw fragility. She knew those lights were straining, overworked, sitting on the edge of collapse. It was like watching a patient smiling on the outside while hiding a terminal illness. Sometimes she wondered if she was the only one who cared. Engineers she had spoken to off the record admitted she was right, but they refused to put their names on anything. "It's not worth the risk," one technician whispered. "The city doesn't like people who make noise." That phrase haunted her. Doesn't like people who make noise. But Maya couldn't stay silent. Every flicker of light, every surge, every unexplained outage was another reminder that her city was headed toward disaster. She felt a responsibility, not just as an engineer, but as someone who loved the people who lived there. She couldn't allow them to walk blindly into catastrophe. And so, her frustration turned into fuel. She wrote more reports, knocked on more doors, and made her voice louder every chance she got. If the city wanted to ignore her, then she would make it impossible for them to pretend they hadn't been warned. Because Maya knew the truth, warnings only mattered if someone listened. And if no one did, the city would pay the price. And deep down, she feared that the day she predicted was coming closer than anyone wanted to believe. The morning sun cut across the skyline, but Maya barely noticed. She had spent the entire night revising her presentation, polishing every slide, every diagram, every word until it reflected not just data, but urgency. Her hands trembled slightly as she loaded the USB drive into her bag. She knew the stakes. This wasn't just another city hall meeting. This was the moment she could make them listen. If only she could get through to them, maybe she could prevent disaster. The city hall building loomed tall, a mix of old stone and modern glass. As she stepped through revolving doors, the sharp click of her heels echoed against the marble floor. Around her, officials and aides hurried past with their papers and coffee cups, barely glancing at her. Maya straightened her shoulders and reminded herself she belonged here. She wasn't just a woman with a complaint. She was a trained engineer with hard evidence. Inside the council chamber, rows of long polished desks faced a central podium. The officials sat elevated on a semicircle dais, looking down on those who came to speak. A low murmur buzzed among the audience, residents, reporters, and lobbyists all waiting for their turn. Maya set her laptop on the small podium and exhaled deeply. When her name was called, she rose and walked forward with steady steps. She introduced herself with calm authority. Dr. Maya Johnson, electrical engineer. I'm here to present findings regarding urgent flaws in the city's power grid. Her first slides displayed neat diagrams of the grid structure, highlighting sections where outdated transformers were straining under increasing demand. She showed photographs of corroded wires, faded warning labels, and blackened circuit boards from the substation she had inspected. She explained load calculations, pointing to figures that proved the city was just one surge away from a total shutdown. For a brief moment, the room was quiet, eyes fixed on her slides. Maya's confidence rose as she continued. This isn't a distant risk, it's imminent. The system was designed decades ago, never meant to handle the kind of demand our population puts on it now. If we don't act, we could face widespread blackouts, even fires. Hospitals, emergency services, businesses, they'll all be left vulnerable. But then the silence cracked. One councilman leaned back in his chair, smirking. Are we supposed to believe the whole city is about to collapse because of a few rusty wires? Laughter rippled across a few others on the panel. Maya gripped the podium, refusing to falter. This isn't speculation, it's science. I have the data right here. Ignoring this could. Another official cut her off, his tone dripping with mockery. So you're saying you, a private citizen, know more than the city's own engineers? We've got teams of experts, Dr. Johnson. If it were really this dire, don't you think they'd have told us? The laughter grew louder, joined by murmurs in the audience. Maya's cheeks burned. She tried again, her voice steady but urgent. With respect, many of those experts are contractors hired by companies who profit from delaying upgrades. I have no interest except the safety of the city. Please look at the numbers. The mayor, sitting in the center seat, finally spoke. His voice was calm but dismissive. Dr. Johnson, thank you for your passion, but we have limited time and many issues to discuss today. Perhaps your warnings are exaggerated. After all, the lights are still on, aren't they? A round of chuckles echoed through chamber. Maya's throat tightened, but she pushed forward. Yes, the lights are on, for now, but waiting until they go off will be too late. One of the aides leaned over to whisper something to the mayor. He smirked and gave a small nod before addressing the room. All right, we've heard enough. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Your concerns will be noted. His gavel struck, signaling the end of her time. Maya's heart sank. She hadn't even finished half her presentation. As she gathered her things, she could still hear bits of laughter, officials joking under their breath. To them, she wasn't a whistleblower. She was a nuisance. As she walked down the chamber steps, a woman in the audience leaned closer and whispered, "Don't let them silence you. I believe you." Maya paused, surprised, but before she could respond, the woman melted back into crowd. That small spark of support flickered in her chest. Maybe not everyone thought she was crazy. Still, outside City Hall, the frustration hit her like a wave. She leaned against a stone pillar and closed her eyes. How many times had she been dismissed like this? How many times had her expertise been treated as less valuable, less believable, simply because she was a black woman challenging authority? Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her brother, Malik. How'd it go? She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. Then she typed, they laughed. Same as always. The reply came quickly. Then make them hear you another way. You've never been one to quit, Maya. His words steadied her. He was right. Quitting wasn't in her nature. She thought back to the night she first noticed the grid's failures, how she had felt that surge of responsibility. She had known then, and she knew now, if she gave up, the city would pay the price. Over the next weeks, Maya tried again. She sent letters, emails, detailed reports. Most went unanswered. A few received curt replies thanking her for her concern. But one evening, a local reporter called. I read your report, the reporter said. If what you're saying is true, it's a big story. But I'll be honest. City Hall says you're exaggerating. Why should I believe you? Because I have proof, Maya replied firmly. She sent over photographs, data charts, and maintenance logs. The reporter promised a look, but Maya knew better than to trust the media completely. They too often echoed the official line. Meanwhile, more signs of trouble emerged. Rolling brownouts flickered through neighborhoods. A transformer near the west side burst into flames one night, sending sparks across the street. The fire department put out quickly, but officials downplayed it as an isolated incident. Each new failure fueled Maya's determination. She wasn't just fighting for recognition. She was fighting against time. The city's leaders could mock her all they wanted, but eventually, the truth would force them to listen. And in the quiet of her apartment, staring at her notes spread across the table, Maya began to wonder, would she have to make them see it the hard way? The days after Maya's disastrous City Hall meeting were a blur of frustration and determination. She returned to her small office in the basement of her apartment building, a space cluttered with files, circuit diagrams, and a worn-out laptop that had seen better days. She replayed every word spoken in that council chamber, the laughter, the dismissive smirks, and the feeling of being belittled in front of an audience that should have taken her seriously. But she didn't have time to wallow in humiliation, because something in the city had already started to change, and not for the better. It began subtly, like a warning whisper in the night. One evening, the lights in her building flickered twice, a sharp stutter before returning to their usual brightness. Her neighbors dismissed it as nothing unusual. After all, In a city with such an old infrastructure, power hiccups were common, but Maya knew better. That kind of synchronized flicker, occurring at exactly the same moment across the block, wasn't just a hiccup. It was a sign of imbalance, the grid straining under uneven loads. Within the week, news outlets started reporting scattered incidents. A grocery store on the south side had lost refrigeration for 2 hours, spoiling thousands of dollars worth of produce. A hospital had to switch to backup generators after a sudden voltage drop left delicate equipment offline. And then there were the smaller stories, the ones most people overlooked. A laundromat closing early because its machines kept shutting down. Traffic lights at 3 major intersections freezing mid-cycle, nearly causing pileups. Maya clipped every article, saved every headline, and built her case file thicker by the day. She knew what these were. Warning tremors before the quake. The city was on the edge of a cascading failure. Late one night, she drove out to an old substation she had studied years ago. The chain-link fence was rusty, its padlock hanging loosely, as if no one cared enough to maintain it properly. She walked the perimeter, flashlight beam catching tangled wires and corroded insulators. Sparks crackled faintly where they shouldn't. She crouched close, watching the patterns of light jump across exposed connections. "Just as I thought," she muttered to herself. "They're patching problems with Band-Aids, not fixing the wounds." Her frustration turned to anger. She had warned them. She had shown them. And now the signs were all around for anyone willing to see. But the city still refused to acknowledge her. When she returned home, her voicemail was full. Residents from neighborhoods where she had once given free electrical workshops were calling her, panicked about strange blackouts and surges. "Ms. Johnson, my daughter's oxygen machine shut down twice today. What do we do?" one frantic mother asked. Another man described how his small bakery's ovens burned out after a sudden power surge fried the wiring. Maya knew this wasn't coincidence. It was escalation. The grid was no longer just fragile. It was beginning to fracture. The next morning, she decided to try again. She marched back to City Hall with her thickened binder, filled with fresh reports, eyewitness accounts, and technical data. This time, she didn't bother requesting to speak before the council. She went straight to the office of Councilman Harris, the man who had mocked her the loudest. His secretary tried to wave her off, but Maya's eyes burned with conviction that made hesitation impossible. "I need 5 minutes," Maya demanded. 5 minutes, and you'll see the disaster that's coming." Harris eventually stepped out, irritation on his face. He clearly remembered her. "Miss Johnson again? Didn't we have this conversation already?" "You didn't listen the first time," she snapped back, shoving a stack of reports into his hands. "Do you think hospitals switching to generators is just bad luck? Do you think children gasping for air on failing machines is an exaggeration? Read this. These are real lives being put at risk." But Harris only skimmed the pages, sighing dramatically. "Power hiccups happen all the time, Miss Johnson. This isn't evidence of some grand catastrophe. It's, what's the word, paranoia. I can't keep wasting the council's time on this." He shoved the binder back into her arms. The dismissal hit like a slap, but Maya didn't back down. She leaned in close, her voice low and fierce. "When the lights go out, and they will, you'll remember that you had a chance to prevent it." She left without waiting for his response. For the first time, she wasn't just disappointed. She was angry enough to act. That evening, as she drove home, the city itself seemed to echo her fury. Streetlights along the highway blinked off in sequence, plunging whole stretches of road into darkness. Cars screeched as drivers panicked, horns blaring. Maya pulled to the side, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was happening faster than she thought. The grid wasn't just unstable, it was unraveling. She parked near a hill overlooking downtown and watched as entire sections of the skyline dimmed, then flared back to life in jagged, uneven bursts. It looked almost alive, like a dying heartbeat struggling to hold on. Maya pulled out her notebook and wrote furiously, documenting times, patterns, and sequences. Every second mattered. Every flicker was proof. Back in her apartment, she compiled her findings and sent them to local journalists. Most ignored her, but one young reporter replied, intrigued. They arranged to meet the next day. For the first time, Maya felt like someone might finally listen. But as the night stretched on, she couldn't sleep. From her window, she watched the lights across the neighborhood continue to sputter, some blocks glowing while others sat in eerie darkness. She thought of the children relying on medical devices, the elderly trapped in high-rises, the businesses teetering on the edge of collapse. The city wasn't just ignoring the warnings anymore. The city was actively breaking down, and only she seemed to see how close they were to disaster. Her mind replayed the council's laughter, Harris's smirk, and the phrase paranoia echoing in her ears. She whispered to herself, almost as a vow, if they won't stop this, then I will. And in that moment, Maya knew the battle had shifted. It was no longer about convincing them. It was about preparing for the inevitable and making sure when it came, the truth couldn't be denied.